Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over 3 incredibly creepy disappearances. In particular, the final story seems to indicate that foul play was involved, and the piece of evidence suggesting that's the case is really disturbing. It's basically the last thing you'd ever want to hear as a parent. You'll see what I mean, and as always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. Before we get into the video, I want to introduce you to today's sponsor, Surfshark VPN. As Scary Interesting has gotten more popular, as you might imagine, I've naturally become a little more concerned about privacy and security. And this is especially anytime I'm working away from my home office and on public Wi-Fi. That's when a VPN is basically essential. A VPN encrypts your internet connection, creating a secure tunnel between your device and the web, protecting your data like passwords from hackers, surveillance, and tracking. It also routes your connection through servers in different locations, making it appear as though you're browsing from that region. Beyond the security this provides, a great benefit is that it allows you to access location-specific deals and content. Like for example, as a Canadian, streaming services typically only show the Canadian catalog, but with Surfshark, you can access content from any region where they have servers. This also extends to all sorts of price deals, letting you find better offers based on location. Right now, by going to my link in the description, you can get 4 extra months free of Surfshark VPN. And the best part is that even with their most basic plan, you can use it on an unlimited number of devices. This means you can keep your entire household protected with a single subscription. Beyond just their VPN though, Surfshark also offers a data breach alert system that notifies you as soon as your email, ID, credit card, or other personal information gets leaked online. This means you're able to take action and change passwords or anything else to keep yourself protected as soon as it happens. So right now you can get 4 extra months free of Surfshark VPN by going to my link in the description or by going to https://surfshark.com/scare. And on top of everything else, they have a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's no risk in giving it a try. And with all of that said, let's get into today's video. In the summer of 2006, Germany was hosting the FIFA World Cup, and the energy was impossible to ignore. Cities were packed with fans draped in flags from all over the world, and beer gardens overflowed with people singing and shouting. But while most of the country was caught up in the excitement, life went on quietly for 21-year-old Frauke Liebs in the city of Paderborn. Frauke was a student nurse who worked long shifts, studied hard, and yet still managed to keep close ties to her family and friends, all pretty standard stuff. Just about the only thing that was a little strange about Frauke's life at the time was that she shared an apartment with an ex-boyfriend. This is a situation that sounds awkward, and usually is, but it apparently worked without much drama in their case. Although she wasn't caught up in all of the hype over hosting the World Cup, Frauke had been working hard, and on June 20th she had made plans to meet up with friends. Later that night at the Paderborn pub, she planned to watch England and Sweden face off in a pivotal match, but first she would enjoy a nice dinner with her mother. Once that was done, her mother drove her to an Irish pub where Frauke was meeting with her friends. When she arrived, the pub was packed, and among those she was meeting up with was Chris, her ex-boyfriend, but he left to head back to their apartment before the game was over. Frauke stayed behind with her friends until around 11 p.m. when she decided to call it a night, so she said goodbye to her friends and walked out of the pub alone. She probably had no more than a few euros in her pocket, and her apartment was just less than a mile away, so all signs pointed toward her heading home on foot. If that was the case, she almost certainly would have walked in the door of her apartment by 11:30 that night, but that didn't happen. Just before 1 a.m., Chris woke up to a text message from Frauke that simply read, "coming later." That was it, so Chris figured she was grabbing food with friends or just got caught up in the post-game chaos. It wasn't unusual for people to be out late during the World Cup, and the streets were still full of noise at the time the text came in. But as the hours passed and Frauke didn't show up, the vague text started to feel off. More and more, the 2-word message started to not sound like her at all. Her text messages were usually much more engaging and detailed. By the next morning, Frauke still wasn't there, and when she failed to show up for work, her mother phoned the police to report her daughter missing. Authorities actually got to work right away looking for Frauke and trying to piece together her last known movements, and they started with the text message Chris received. The further police looked into it, the more the already odd message took on a whole new level of weirdness. The message, it turns out, wasn't even sent from Paderborn. It had been sent from Nyleen, a small town about 35 kilometers away. Immediately, this was concerning because it was a place Frauke had no reason to be, especially not that late at night and certainly not on foot. Something had definitely happened to her after she left the pub. With Paderborn looking high and low for her, things got even stranger. Chris started receiving phone calls from her phone. He didn't just receive one either. Over the course of the next week, Frauke would call Chris 5 times. Each call was short and vague, but it was undoubtedly Frauke on the other end of the line. She always sounded tired, like she hadn't slept, and she kept insisting that she would be home soon, but she never explained where she was or why she hadn't returned already. Police traced each of the calls that came in, and that only added to the confusion. None of them came from Nyheim, where the text originated. Instead, the calls pinged from various industrial zones around Paderborn, and never the same one twice. It was as if she were moving or being moved from place to place with no clear reason. These were also quiet, empty parts of the city where no one hangs around unless they have a reason to be there. During the calls with Chris as well, Frauke's answers were like she didn't have time to talk or as if someone else were listening in. Chris would ask her direct questions like if she was okay or where she was, but she dodged them and gave the bare minimum in response. It just wasn't like her, and something was obviously wrong. The final call came on June 27th, exactly 1 week after she disappeared. During this call, her sister was with Chris, and she spoke to Frauke too. During their brief conversation, Frauke's sister asked her a question that she hadn't been asked yet. Frauke's sister asked her, "Are you being held against your will?" And what happened next has haunted the case of her since. Frauke first whispered yes, but almost immediately followed it up with a louder no. Then the line went dead, and that was the last anyone ever heard from her. After that call, the phone went silent for good. Once the calls stopped, investigators were left with a trail that didn't make much sense. The only solid piece of evidence they had was the origin of Frauke's first text. Again, she had no reason to be in Nyheim, she had no friends in that area, and by all accounts, she had no other transportation to get there. This immediately suggested that she hadn't traveled there on her own. The locations of the phone calls also weren't connected by anything obvious, and pretty quickly, it started to look to police like an attempt to throw them off the trail. If Frauke had been taken to Nyheim and kept somewhere nearby, she may have been transported to areas around Paderborn to make the phone calls so that her actual holding location would remain a mystery. In analyzing the content of the calls themselves, police believe that she was avoiding direct answers to questions because she wasn't allowed to speak freely. With all of this together, they developed a working theory that she had been allowed to call Chris under supervision, possibly by someone who hoped the brief contact would buy them time or lower suspicion. Investigators then went on to check every person she knew, from coworkers to casual online contacts. More than 900 people were then questioned, but one by one, they were all ruled out. Each of them had solid alibis that accounted for their whereabouts on the night Frauke went missing. Days then turned into weeks, and then to months with absolutely no new leads or information. Then, on October 4th, 2006, more than 3 months after Frauke's last phone call, a hunter walking through a wooded area near Lichtenau stumbled across human remains. The location was remote, close to a state road, but surrounded by dense forests. Locals called that patch of land Totengrund, which translates ominously to Valley of the Dead. The remains were severely decomposed and essentially skeletonized, but authorities were able to determine that it was Frauke. Because of the state of the body, there was no clear way to determine how she died or exactly when, but her clothing matched the outfit she'd been wearing the night she disappeared. She wore blue jeans and a short-sleeved red t-shirt with a collar. Many of her other belongings were missing though. Her Nokia phone, a black handbag, a wallet, and a fossil wristwatch were nowhere near the side of the body, and none of those items were ever found despite searches of the surrounding land. Strangely though, a small cross was found with the remains. It looked like it had been part of a necklace, but no one in Frauke's life recognized it as something she wore or even owned. The possibility that it belonged to the killer became one of the few solid clues investigators had, but unfortunately this didn't lead to any breakthroughs. The spot where she was found also didn't appear to be a place where she had been kept. It was more of a dump site chosen after the fact. Her mother spent years maintaining a website dedicated to her daughter, but on October 4th, 2023, exactly 17 years after Frauke's remains were found, the site was taken down. Exhausted from years of unanswered questions, her mother said she had given up on finding her daughter's killer. To this day, what happened to Frauke remains a mystery. Hedviga Golick was born in 1924 in what was then called the Kingdom of Italy. We don't know much about her childhood or early adult years, but by 1961 she was living in Zagreb, Croatia, and working as a nurse at a local health center. At the time, she was living in a shoebox-like 635-foot square apartment that she previously shared with her boyfriend. The apartment was located in an area that was owned by Yugoslavia's state-run housing system, and Hedviga and her boyfriend were Jehovah's Witnesses, and when they met, he was a building janitor, superintendent, and a jack-of-all-trades. According to some sources, he got the tiny apartment free of charge as part of his compensation. We don't know why the couple broke up or what happened to him afterwards, but for some reason she continued living there instead of him. And interestingly, her tiny and by all accounts depressing apartment was the only residential unit on the 4th floor. In fact, other than the occasional maintenance man, nobody had any reason to go higher than the 3rd floor. So for the most part, Hedviga was isolated from the other tenants, and soon this wasn't just because she had the fourth floor to herself. Somewhere along the line, she apparently lost or quit her job and became what might politely be described as an eccentric, antisocial shut-in. Hedviga had a sister that also lived in Zagreb, but they never saw one another or spoke by phone because they didn't get along. As for the tenants on the other floors, nobody knew much about Hedviga or had much contact with her. She also didn't have any friends in the building in the traditional sense, but another resident named Katica regularly ran errands for her and did some food shopping for her. It's not really clear how the two met or how they knew one another, but over time they worked out a system where Hedviga lowered a bucket with money and a shopping list down to Katica's floor when she needed food and other stuff for her apartment. When Katica saw the bucket on the landing, she'd go to the store, buy the items on the list, and leave them at Hedviga's door along with any change if there was any. Katica might have had a soft spot in her heart for Hedviga, or she was simply trying to be helpful, but like everyone else, she apparently gave her a wide berth because she was allegedly prone to drastic and unpredictable mood swings. Some tenants even described her as a troubled but altogether gentle and harmless soul, but according to some others, she regularly yelled at them and at total strangers she encountered on the street outside the building. Now at this point, the story gets a little hazy. Some residents claim that Hedviga vanished in 1966, while others said they saw her in and around the building as late as 1973. The last time Katica saw her, she was standing outside the main entrance talking to 3 young men, but when questioned years later, she couldn't remember when it was and she didn't know who the young men were. But either way, despite her reputation, most of the tenants didn't give her a second thought when she lived there, let alone when she fell off the radar. It was actually common that she disappeared for extended periods of time. Once she even sublet the apartment while she was away, and according to one tenant, Hedviga mentioned in passing that she was planning on moving to Belgrade, Serbia. This tenant apparently also got the impression that she was going there to join a cult and live in a commune. As a result of all of this, the Zagreb police said nobody ever officially reported Hedviga missing. Someone apparently did call the police sometime in 1973 to say they were worried about her, but the authorities didn't put much effort into tracking her down or even checking to make sure she was okay. This might have been the end of the story, but then 9 years later, in 1981, the other tenants scraped together a relatively small amount of money to settle an unpaid debt Hedviga had left behind. The nature of the debt isn't entirely clear, but it's likely it had something to do with the apartment, and it's also safe to say the tenants didn't part with their hard-earned money out of the kindness of their hearts or because they had any particular affection for Hedviga. Instead, they apparently did it to put themselves in a position to inherit the apartment when building management finally got around to evicting her and clearing out the items she left behind. But even then, nobody took the time to walk up the dark stairwell and knock on her door to see if she was still there. Again, in all likelihood, this was probably because they all knew she was gone and she wasn't coming back. Another key piece of this was that tenancy issues in state-run apartment complexes in Yugoslavia often took months or years to play themselves out. As such, the apartment wasn't officially declared as abandoned until a decade later in mid-1991. And by then, the country was also in the middle of the Croatian War of Independence that lasted until the summer of 1995. Under the circumstances, dealing with a tiny apartment that may or may not have been inhabited by a troubled recluse wasn't exactly a big priority for local authorities. So once again, nothing happened for nearly another decade until an odd notice appeared on the apartment door in 1998. Residents claimed the notice had been posted by the city's Census Commission. It stated that anyone who entered or occupied the apartment would be subject to criminal prosecution. The other tenants took this seriously, and so the apartment sat undisturbed for yet another decade until a group of residents and a building manager jimmied the lock and walked in on May 12, 2008. They probably expected to find a dust and cobweb-ridden apartment littered with garbage, spoiled food, and useless items Hedviga had left behind. And in a sense, they were spot on. But upon entering the apartment, they also encountered something unlike anything any of them had ever seen. The first thing they were hit with was an overwhelming odor. Then, when their eyes adjusted to the low-light conditions, they found themselves nearly face-to-face with a Hedviga Golick. By then, nobody had seen her for somewhere between 35 and 42 years. Accounts of the rest of that day vary. According to some sources, she was seated in an armchair in front of a white porcelain cup that had once been full of steaming hot tea. Other accounts claim she was laid out on the rickety bed in the corner, but whatever the case, her shriveled, leathery, and remarkably well-preserved body was facing the TV just a few feet from the horrified neighbors. They then immediately backed to the apartment and notified the authorities that Hedviga hadn't gone to Belgrade after all. Before removing the body, investigators noted that the windows were partially open and that the electricity was still on. The medical examiner was also only able to determine that Hedviga probably died in the mid-60s or early 70s. This matched up with the last time various residents of the building said they saw her. Based on the decomposition of the body, investigators concluded that she died during the winter and that nobody reported smelling anything because the windows were open. And since the electricity remained on for so long, the ventilation system reduced the moisture and kept relatively fresh air circulating throughout the apartment. Together, these conditions prevented the body from putrefying quickly like it would have if she died during the summer. And as far as the medical examiner could tell, Hedviga sat or lay down with a cup of tea to watch TV and simply died from natural causes. With that said though, the manner of death couldn't be fully determined, and so there's also been some speculation that Hedviga may not have died from natural causes after all. Interestingly, records show that the building's architect paid Hedviga's electricity bill for nearly 4 decades before he passed away in 2005. This was just 3 years before her body was discovered. It's also seen as suspicious that officials from the city's Census Commission claim they never issued the notice found on Hedviga's door in 1998. It might be as simple as some sort of clerical error, but unfortunately, we'll probably never know. But what we do know is that if she were alive, Hedviga would have been 84 years old in 2008 when her body was found. That means she spent more time dead in that apartment in Zagreb than she did alive, and for the most part, she was simply forgotten. Nyleen Kay Briscoe was born in Orange, California on September 18, 1978. And by the summer of 1983, Nyleen, her mother, her stepfather, and her brother and sister were all living in Montana. On the morning of Saturday, June 25th, they packed into the family cruiser and headed out to the scenic Elkhorn Park in west central Montana. That day, the Capital City Radio Ham Club was holding an event at the park, which is located in Helena National Forest. By late morning, the park was full of ham operators, their spouses, and their children doing what people do at picnics. That afternoon, after lunch, the kids wandered in and out of the wooded areas near the picnic site, playing tag and exploring these short trails. The children, for the most part, apparently stayed mostly within 20 to 50 yards of the adults. Sometime around 1 p.m., 4-year-old Nyleen and several other children followed a narrow footpath, and at one point the other kids ran ahead, putting them about 10 to 20 yards in front of her. Nyleen was still walking behind them, still on the same path, but briefly out of their line of sight, either due to the forest or because they weren't paying attention. When the kids looked back only a few moments later, she was no longer on the trail, she was just completely out of sight. The children then hurried back to where she was, but when they couldn't find her, they went back down the trail to the picnic area and told the adults they couldn't find her. They called her name over and over as they searched, but to their horror, there was no trace of her or her belongings. Shortly afterwards, Search and Rescue got the call to help organize and lead the official search effort less than an hour later. The organizers then formed into long lines in which the searchers were an arm's length apart to ensure nothing was missed. They then continued searching like this for hours, well into the night, until they were just too exhausted to continue. Over the following days, they broke up beaver dams, drained ponds, cleared brush, checked additional caves and mine shafts, and rechecked ground that had already been covered multiple times. But not only did they not find Nyleen, they didn't even find so much as a shoe or a bit of torn t-shirt to at least prove she'd ever been there in the first place. At least officially, the search lasted 10 days and included more than 2,500 searchers. Searchers had never been involved in such a massive and altogether unsuccessful effort, and that might be because the explanation was far more sinister than simply being missing in the forest. Statistics show that relatives and acquaintances commit more than 3/4 of all kidnappings. As such, investigators took a close look at Nyleen's family members. Her stepfather was a person of interest from the very beginning, but he and her other relatives were all eventually cleared of having anything to do with her disappearance. So next, Nyleen's face was eventually emblazoned on milk cartons across the country. And this generated tons of new leads, but again, most of them didn't pan out. Sadly, for months afterward, there was just nothing, and the family had to just live with the events of that day and no answers. That was until the case took an unexpected turn in late 1985, nearly 2.5 years after Nyleen's disappearance. That November, her family and a number of missing person advocacy groups began receiving calls and letters from an unknown man who claimed to be the person who had taken her. Disturbingly, the man allegedly admitted to assaulting her but went on to say that she was happy and healthy and that they traveled the world together. Then a few months later, in early 1986, a local police department in Wisconsin got another letter from a man who also claimed that he'd abducted a girl named Kay in Montana in the summer of 1983, which again was Nyleen's middle name. The envelope had a postmark from Madison, Wisconsin. And as for the letter itself, what made it even creepier is that it contained details of the disappearance that were never released to the public. According to investigators, this could only mean that the writer had an intimate knowledge of the abduction. The letter also stated that the man had significant investment income and that he worked from home and that he homeschooled her. Shortly after sending the letter, the man apparently placed a number of calls to Child Find America's headquarters in New York City. Interestingly, the calls were all traced to phone booths in Wisconsin, one of which was in Edgerton, about 75 miles west of Milwaukee. At about the same time, a concerned local reported seeing a girl who looked a lot like Nyleen at a restaurant in Janesville, Wisconsin, about 15 miles south of Edgerton. Unfortunately, though, the setting was never confirmed, and authorities never determined who wrote the letters and made the telephone calls, or whether or not they were legitimate. Afterward, the case went cold once again. The case then got a much-needed boost in 1990 when it was featured on an episode of the show Unsolved Mysteries. In addition to recreating the events leading up to Nyleen's disappearance, the producers also included the following excerpts from letters that were never released to the public. Quote, "I picked up Kay on the road in the Elkhorn Park area between Helena and Boulder. She was crying and frightened, and as I held her, she was shaking, and I decided that I would keep her and love her. I took her home with me. I have a nice investment income and I can work at home, so I care for her myself all the time. I teach her at home and she likes to go with me when I travel." She would gladly recount to you the trips to San Francisco, New York, Oklahoma City, New Orleans, Nashville, Chicago, Puerto Rico, and Canada. We were even in Britain for a month last year and she loved it. Then in brackets it writes, "Nobody questions passports." Next, it goes on to say, quote, "Her hair is short and curly now and she's really grown. She is about 45 inches and around 50 pounds. She has all 4 of her permanent upper teeth and 2 of her lower incisors at this time. She eats well, her favorite meal is pizza and cherry coke," end quote. And chillingly, one of the letters ended with this, quote, "I love her and I have her, I just can't let her go," end quote. After the episode aired, a viewer contacted the authorities and told them that Nyleen may have been a classmate of his in Bellingham, Washington years before. And she looked a lot like Nyleen and was about the same age, but unfortunately her name was actually Monica. To everyone's surprise though, she'd actually also been kidnapped by her father in Burbank, California in 1982. But as wonderful as the discovery was for Monica and her family, the Unsolved Mysteries coverage didn't do anything for Nyleen's family. The case took another strange turn when Nyleen's mother, Nancy, was assaulted and killed in a hotel room in Mexico City the following year. Unfortunately, the details of that case are limited, and it's unclear what she was doing there in the first place. But the chances of a disappearance and a murder occurring in the same family in unrelated incidents is certainly strange to say the least. 2 years later, in 1997, a nurse at a hospital in New Orleans claimed that she had a brief interaction with a pregnant 19-year-old named Helena who looked a lot like Nyleen. The nurse said the young woman was with a man who was much older than she was, and during check-in, the woman apparently told the nurse that she grew up in another country. She and the man then got up and left abruptly when the nurse asked for her full name, address, and medical history, and that is unfortunately what is left of the evidence. According to police, new tips and leads continued coming into the department for decades after the baffling disappearance. It's not clear if Nyleen simply went missing in the forest that day or if those letters were really true and she is alive somewhere. Given what's out there, it certainly seems like we'll just never know. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and a special thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon or as a channel member. If you're interested, we offer early access videos that are released roughly a week before the regular YouTube uploads. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it using the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.